Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional, human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumila Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling us on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. According to the South African Institute of International Relations, elections have been identified as an indispensable foundation of democracy. As a concept, an election is primarily a contest among groups, mainly political parties. Elections have also been seen as institutional mechanisms that implement democracy by allowing citizens to choose among candidates or issues. An election is a modality of freely choosing leaders, representatives, and democracy. Essential, therefore, elections have to do with the process of choosing a person or a group of people for a position, usually by voting. The relationship between elections and democracy is considered to be so strong that some scholars have argued that all democratic variables revolve around elections. Today on Rights and Recourse, we examine the elections taking place on the African continent during the month of March, with an emphasis on Kenya. The question of whether elections in Africa translate into democracy looms large. But first, let's take a look at this insert.
In Nairobi's Kamukunji area, metalwork artisans are hard at work, beating metal into shape and hoping to get the best bargain for the finished product.
Times back we used to have businesses, but currently we don't have anything. We come here like in the morning, we take the whole day, we make so less sales. I may say in summary it's tough.
Away from here, politicians are out on the campaign trail, selling their political agenda, hoping to win the hearts of the electorate. Opinion polls indicate that although there are 8 presidential candidates, the real race is between incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. They are facing each other for a second time. The first time was in 2013. This time, the stakes are higher.
Whenever you have an incumbent, they have to intensify their efforts to remain. You don't want to be the incumbent that only did 5 years and then left.
Kenyatta has been in power for 4 years now. He came to power on a campaign pledge to fight corruption, improve healthcare and educational standards, as well as create more jobs. Opinion on his performance here in Kamukunji is divided, depending on who you ask. The last 4 years have been very good. Kenyatta has built roads, the standard gauge railway is complete, and he has fought terrorism. He has electrified the country, so we will soon be an industrialized nation.
We must get food first as a first priority, better housing and health, then we go to the next level, which is roads and infrastructure. But when the government keeps on talking about big roads and rails and stuff, when our children go home hungry, I don't think that's the right thing, so I'll be voting against that.
As another election beckons, both sides of the political divide have fresh election promises. While Kenyatta is asking for another 5 years to complete his development projects, Odinga, the flag bearer for the opposition coalition, the National Super Alliance, NASA, says Kenyatta's time is up, arguing that the incumbent has not kept his campaign pledges.
The rallying call has been around the high cost of living and the state of our economy as a country. We've seen people being rallied, of course, around the ethnic blocks, which never changes. So we're doing our numbers, even when you see the different groups doing their numbers around their supporters, it is along ethnic lines.
The issue of ethnicity has divided the country right down the middle. The numbers from opinion polls tell it all. Kenyatta is ahead with 47% of the vote and Odinga at 42%. At least 3% of the registered voters do not plan to vote, while another 8% are undecided. Here lies the issue of the young voters. At least 51% of the electorate this year are young Kenyans below the age of 35. Kenya, like many African countries, is plagued by unemployment. And so unemployment and the creation of jobs will be one of the main factors that will determine who carries the day come the 8th of August. With both sides not having satisfied the youthful voter, many young people are now seeking elective posts in the counties. Under Kenya's 2010 constitution, power has been devolved to the 47 counties. The idea is to share out development funds. Counties get at least 20% of the national revenue.
Power will not all be concentrated in Nairobi.
So as Kenya goes to the polls, all eyes here in Kamukunji and indeed the rest of the country will not just be on the man who takes the presidency, but also county positions to deliver on their campaign pledges in a bid to better the lives of the voters. Sarah Kimani, SABC News, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, thank you very much for Sarah there. That's an insert she sent during the week. We want to get a sense of what the Kenyans are saying about these elections. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Ms. Lisa Lowe-Vaudran. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. A senior research consultant from the Institute of Security Studies. From our Durban studio, we're joined by Mr. Luko Namguni, independent analyst from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse. Well, first of all, let's start with the elections that took place on Friday in Rwanda. We'll come back to the issues about Kenya, although the rest of the program will be based on Kenya. The one thing that confused me yesterday was to read that President Kagame has been elected back into power after he changed the constitution for a third term, despite the fact that the AU said heads of state must rule for 2 terms. He changed the constitution and he went for the third term. When I saw that he was elected by 98% of the voters, and I said to myself, is this man popular, or are the people afraid of some dictator who's looming large?
Yes, it's a very difficult question because Paul Kagame is popular. He's also popular on the continent, and Rwanda is seen as a model for economic development, which makes it very difficult to see those figures of the elections and then to turn around and say, yes, I think we can agree that he's a very authoritarian leader who believes that this economic development comes, from the top down. But when it comes to the elections, I think there was no surprise because that constitutional change in December 2015 was almost 100% of people voted for him to have a third term. It's a third term, but we must also remember that Kagame has really been in power after the RPF took power in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. So the first election was in 2000, then he was elected again, and it's a 7-year term. Now you can stand, we might have Paul Kagame ruling Rwanda for quite some time in future. As I say, it's very difficult, but it is extremely important to recognize that it's not only the election day. Rwandans might have voted for Kagame in huge numbers, over 90% on election day, but is there a level playing field? Is there a free and fair system? In terms of, I've been to elections in Rwanda where you would hardly even notice that there was any opposition because they have so little time to campaign, they've got little means to campaign, the media is very restricted. So ultimately, I think as I say, Kagame is very popular for what he's done in terms of the economy. But when it comes to the politics and free and fair elections, 98% really, I think we should question that result.
Well, it sounded very much, somebody was saying, sounds very much, Mr. Mguni, I don't know whether you want to come in there, it sounded very much like somebody was saying, it's like the people in Iraq, when they were voting for Saddam Hussein, they were 90% or 98% somewhere there voting for Saddam Hussein. I don't know whether, I can't hear you, I don't know whether you can hear us down in Durban.
Men and
well, it looks like we can't hear Durban there. Let's stay with Liesl here. Liesl, let's go to Kenya. In Kenya, there is this perception that historically the presidency has been the preserve of 2 ethnic groups, the Kikuyu and the Kalenjin. And another thing that's been very important about these elections is that the 2 men who are standing for election for the president, Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta. Their fathers were running Kenya in the 60s, in 1964 when Kenya got independent. Oginga Odinga, Raila's father, and Jomo Kenyatta, Uhuru's father. Looks like it's a family affair.
It is very interesting. I mean, Jomo Kenyatta, as you say, the father of Uhuru Kenyatta. And the interesting thing with Raila Odinga, his father was never president. He was vice president. Now, Raila Odinga was prime minister, of course, under Kibaki.
Yeah, under Kibaki, that compromise after the 2007 elections.
After 2007 and the 2008 violence. So he is really now in his 70s. He stood for president this is his fourth chance. So that's why people are so worried, and the stakes are really very high because I think, as we heard from your report, usually on the African continent, it's unusual for a president just to stay on for one term because the incumbency comes with a lot of advantages. So he would really want to have a second term, but Odinga really wants to be president as well. As far as two families and this issue of dynasty goes, I think we must remember that around the world, it's not unusual to have a Bush father and a Bush son, and now we have Trudeau as, Prime Minister of Canada. In Africa, of course, we do have Ali Bongo, who's succeeded his father, Omar Bongo, in Gabon. Nyasingbe Ayendema's son, Faure Nyasingbe, is now president in Togo. But I think as long as the elections are free and fair and there's a true competition, then it's okay. I mean, as I said, it's a phenomenon, and I think it's probably about recycling the elites that worries people. Is these are elites that kind of cling to power. But the main thing is probably the process, whether it's free and fair.
Whether it's free and fair. Lukona, if you can hear us down in Durban, the question I want to ask you is, after the 2007 elections and the violence that followed that, post the election, the wise men of Africa, that included the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kofi Annan, suggested that the constitutional institutions of Kenya did not work. Now, can we say today they are working?
Well, I hope you can hear me now. Well, after that intervention by the team led by Kofi Annan, I think Kenya went on towards constitutional consolidation. You first have to consolidate what is on paper and then give power to people and give people a meaning of what it is to be in a democracy. I think insofar as that is concerned, with the 2010 constitution that came into place, devolving power to counties, and I got an opportunity to see that process unfold when I visited Kenya in 2015, and people were sort of excited about this idea of development that is decentralized, closer to them, and then they can hold the leaders much accountable. And I think that is the sphere of governance that in Kenya is becoming much more important, much more contested because of the flow of resources, but also because of the powers that come with that flow of resources. So in one instance, one would say the systems are probably gaining traction. People are getting a buy-in. They're understanding their place within that democratic framework that has been architectured in 2010. And slowly we are getting there. You saw the elections of 2013, I think, where there was a bit of violence, but it was very easily contained to an extent, and to some degree I think the mechanisms of law enforcement respond much more better, much more fairly and quite evenly, without seemingly favoring one faction over the other during an election process and on the election day. So I think much has been done to bring Kenya up to speed insofar as those institutions are concerned. And lastly, I think the Kenyan people themselves have over time rallied behind their government, closed rank, and this is why when we have seen some incidents of terrorist attacks, it is the mall attack that happened or the college that was attacked in 2015, you really saw an instance of people united to defend their country, asking the government to lead them because they believe in those institutions to actually take lead and respond to these threats. It's no longer an instance where people in their communities would want to sort of go around and search for themselves and take the law into their own hands. So there is a sense that I think some consolidation has happened on that front of advancing institutions there.
Lizel, I spoke earlier about the, when I referred to Lukona down in Durban, I spoke about the constitutional institutions that were hardly working. In Kenya, there's been this considerable criticism of the Independent Electoral Commission, Electoral and Boundaries Commission. I think it's a hybrid between what we call the Electoral Commission and the what we call the Demarcation Board. The body running the election issues have included reliability of the technology being used and the alleged partiality of the commission's former leadership. And the recent printing of 1.2 million extra ballot papers have raised suspicion of planned vote rigging. Coupled to this, the torture and the murder of Christopher Msando, the Commission's head of information technology.
Yes, that was very worrying. I mean, that was just last weekend. And apparently on Monday they were going to test this new the system, the electronic voting system. I think it is worrying, and it undermines the process. There are obviously actors, well, we don't know. It could have been a random criminal act, but I think everybody, all the indications point to he was such an important figure in the whole independent electoral commission that it points to some factors in the process that want to undermine people's confidence in the process. We saw in Nigeria in 2015 also how people were so worried that the electoral system will fail. So if I understand correctly, but in the end, there was a democratic change of government in Nigeria that we all know. I mean, the challenges, they are massive given the number of voters. So in Kenya, if I understand correctly, there is a manual backup. So we have almost like a hybrid system, so that if the electronic system fails, it will still there will still be a backup, because it's extremely important for people to have confidence in the process. And we will only know after Tuesday, really, if the vote goes well and whether the losers accept the results. I mean, that's always the tricky...
How important are these elections for Kenya? We have seen there are over 5,000 election observers, amongst them former President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, the John Kufuor of Ghana, and John Kerry, former U.S. presidential hopeful and Secretary of State.
Exactly. There's really high-profile teams that are coming to Kenya. I think, and for months now, we've heard think tanks and observers and people warning against violence, because this is extremely important. As I said, on the presidential level, there is really a very tight contest. Even now, we don't know. All the polls say that Odinga and Kenyatta are so close to one another. But then in each one of the 47 counties, the stakes are high. These are important jobs, the governors of these counties, and also the ethnic factor in Kenya is something widely talked about. So in counties where you would have a more balanced representation of the various ethnic groups, and there's not one that is dominant, there's the potential for violence. In fact, Kenyans say that if there is going to be some conflict, it would be rather around the county elections than perhaps the presidential elections. There are other issues at play rather than just the ethnic factor. So these are extremely important. In 2013, Odinga, the opposition, contested the results, but I think the nation altogether felt that after what happened in 2007, 2008, we must move on and accept if the Constitutional Court, rules out any wrongdoing during the elections. The world's eyes are on these elections, also because they are considered to be a test case for democracy, I mean, the Kenyans are extremely connected. We've got more than 2 million Twitter accounts in Kenya. People talk about the Silicon Valley of Africa. There have been all these allegations of fake news, etc. So it's a very modern election, a tight race, and it's important for us that it goes well, actually.
Look, I don't want to overemphasize this issue of tribalism and ethnicity, but one of the other things that are very strong is that it is said that without elevating it, tribalism and ethnicity in Kenya has always been seen as problematic during Kenya's elections. And in the fact that it always juxtaposed the write-ups leading to the elections, like the emphasis that Odinga is supported largely by the Kamba, the Luhia, the Luo, the Maasai, could it be detrimental if a dispute occurs as we saw in 2007?
Well, I mean, the question of ethnicity does play a role because it talks to people's homes in the sense, where are my roots? And some people will want to play that card very strongly in terms of where do I come from, and want people from there to plead serious allegiance. Some people that I spoke to, one fellow that I spoke to, in fact, Dennis Muniki, a researcher in Kenya, alluded to the fact that also the type of presidential system can actually motivate an ethnicist approach to the election. So when you have people that are directly elected by constituencies in countries where the question of the ethnic divide is highly contested and has serious implications for the process, that direct election could lead to people wanting to stand behind people solely because they are of the same ethnic group. So then the antidote for that would probably to propose a parliamentary system and have a way of making sure that multi-partyism that cuts across the ethnic divide is promoted, and ensure that there is a regulation in terms of a proportional spread of seats in the parliament, especially where you have a situation in some instances of a hybrid electoral system where people to parliament are elected via constituency and through the proportional representation system. So it's always about trying to actually refine the framework of democracy that you implement in a country to try and subvert some of these problems that keep on recurring from election to election, so that, as Lizelle is saying, you safeguard the process itself of the build-up to the election date, because it's not really just about did people on the day cast their votes in a free and fair manner. It's also about the integrity of the institutions and the architecture that you actually put in place years before the election actually comes on by. So I do think that the question of ethnicity needs to continuously be spoken about relative to the institutions and mechanisms of the electoral system that we put in place, and ask the question, is it not time in in what we call probably high tension spots to actually rethink the framework and the electoral system that we implement there?
Lizelle, without undermining the level of intellectual intelligentsia in Kenya, one of the problems I've always maintained, that I might be wrong in this view, that as long as African systems of democracy are parliamentary or presidential and not constitutional democracies, there will always be a real democratic deficit.
Yes, you know, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I think the debate on the continent is around those issues. I mean, in South Africa, we don't have direct presidential elections. And especially in Francophone Africa, that I know much better actually, there's a democratic deficit because everything is around the presidential elections. It's the general elections and parliamentary elections we hardly ever speak about. You go from, as soon as the president is elected, we're already going, everything is focused on the next presidential elections. Well, whereas, for example, in the DRC now, all our attention is focused on whether the elections are going to take place or not, Joseph Kabila, etc. Whereas in South Africa, it's this cloak and dagger behind closed doors, and everybody's wondering what is happening within the corridors of power within the African National Congress. So, these are two systems. As I say, I'm not an expert, but it is a debate on the continent. What would be the best way to diffuse this power struggle at the top? And make it more accessible. I mean, ultimately, the aim of democracy is for people to be able to hold politicians accountable, number one, and to feel that they are genuinely represented and they have a say in those who govern them.
Let's go to Akona on this very question. Lukona, I'm sorry, Lukona, the issues I was raising is many times elections in Africa are around the president, as Liesl has eloquently said here, and mostly you find parliamentary democracies and presidential democracies are not constitutional democracies. The question is, I went back to the Kenyan constitution that was adopted in 2010. The question, it's now a constitutional democracy. The question is, do the people on the ground understand what a constitutional democracy actually mean for them?
It's a very difficult one. You will not expect citizens to understand what a constitutional democracy actually means for them if you do not take the time to educate them and make sure that you unpack exactly what their rights and responsibilities are to this constitutional democracy. But, one of the emerging phenomenons now, which we are noting, as you noted at the start of this show, with Rwanda, is what some people have come to term constitutional coups. And constitutional coups refers to the use of constitutions to gain legitimacy. So you come in as a leader, you enact a constitution that is lauded really the world over and is seen as legitimate, and it legitimizes your stay in power. But when your term comes closer to an end, you then do a constitutional coup by actually extending your term of office or extending even the years of the presidential term. I mean, if you remember in Senegal, then President Wade, who was lauded for his involvement in the new architecture of Africa with the African Union and with NEPAD, along his colleagues such as Obasanjo and Thabo Mbeki at the time, when time came for him to leave power, he tried to extend not only his term but also the presidential term to be 7 years. And the people of Senegal rejected summarily those attempts when he went to the polls. They didn't vote him back into power. You have Rwanda, a situation where Kagame actually managed to do that and now has come back. And what I had wanted to say when we could not hear each other at the time was that there is a sense that some people are abusing their popularity to actually make sure that they lead in perpetuity. And now that is problematic, because if you are going to be a constitutional democracy, it means you are willing to abide by the prescripts of that constitution. And really we see this absent from some leaders. So the constitutions must serve them and their interests. They do not see them as under the dictates of that constitution. So the constitution can be amended as and when they wish. This is a problem that is growing in the continent. As we are saying, elections are an essential part of democracy. People have embraced elections, but they've also embraced constitutions. They're actually codifying a lot of things and making sure that everybody knows what are the rules to play by. But when time comes to leave power, they actually do not see that they must abide by that, and then they try and amend favorably to to them. And this is a growing phenomena in the continent, and it is quite worrying because democracies, especially constitutional democracies, rest on the ability that we set precedent to follow what the Constitution says. Because if we can willy-nilly amend to afford the interests of the day an opportunity to thrive, not the interests of the country by those constitutional amendments, then we are in a way killing the very essence of the logic of constitutional democracies, and we render them quite hollow in actual fact over time. And so this phenomena of constitutional coups is also problematic going forward, and how leaders actually communicate with their constituencies. Because if a leader is popular, they'll say, no, you still want me to lead. People will say, yes, we still want you to lead. Then they say, no, the people have mandated us that we must continue in office, therefore we're amending, guided by people. Of course, if you are a popular leader, you must know that people will want you to lead, but you must ask the question that says, is this in the best interest of the country? If I were to retreat, take leave of absence from the presidential seat and make sure that I'm still able to provide counsel in the transition and not see myself as an indispensable part of the country in leadership, and therefore allow other people space to actually lead. Because some of these people, Mr. Mateza, came into power very young. I mean, the likes of Kagame, the likes of Dos Santos in Angola. Kagame came into power at 43, Dos Santos at 37.
We must go for a break. Let's hold it there. Let's go for a break. But when we come back, we will talk about the manifestos of these two parties. I looked at the manifestos and I found something very interesting in both the manifestos of the Jubilee Party and the NASA Party. As we come back, if you'd like to join us, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rise Recourse. Alternatively, send us an email at riseandrecourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Young states compared to the rest of the globe, definitely. I mean, Kenya, you could credit Uhuru Kenyatta for having made important changes in terms of the new constitution. Also, the infrastructure that he's brought. Of course, terrorism has become an issue that Kenya has grappled with, a very controversial decision to enter into war with Somalia and send the Kenyan army. But I think in terms of transformation of the country, there is still a lot to be done in terms of education and health services to and uplifting poor, just like in the rest of the continent.
Like all African countries, including us here in South Africa, they have a big problem of job creation, and most of the people who are not in jobs are the youth, and that could be a keg waiting to explode. How will they create these jobs if the economy of these countries are not growing?
Exactly. I mean, there is a drive, as I said earlier, for Kenya to become sort of the Silicon Valley, and there's been unbelievable innovation, and we see all these big meetings about connectivity, etc. But that is perhaps just a drop in the ocean. I mean, the African Union this year has its theme, empowering the youth, and I think it is building on the demographic dividend, which has now become a watchword on the continent. But it is, you could see it in a positive way, that if we could mobilize this young continent, while others, even China, Europe, etc., are growing older and need a younger workforce, Africa can use this as take off to faster growth, but then we need certain systems in place and predictable economic and political systems, which undermine, of course, the job creation and the investment. China is involved in a big way, and as we saw the infrastructure now just this year that have been announced in Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta successfully mobilized those resources. And Kenya and the East African community is working together to create more of a regional hub. Rwanda and Uganda, most of the transport goes through Kenya, and that's also one of the reasons why we need good elections, because if we're going to have the Kenya in trouble as in 2008, the whole region suffers. Now South Sudan as well, a problem country, but also uses Kenya. So there are projects in place, but it is extremely difficult, and it is linked to all the other issues on the continent.
Lukoda, one of the issues on the manifesto of the Jubilee Party is that they are looking at good governance, justice, and fight against corruption. Has Kenya made strides in fighting corruption? What about the spurning of the ICC against in the cases against the Vice President, William Ruto, and the President? Is it committed to justice?
That is a very contested one, especially if you talk to Kenyan people. They do give an impression that they are highly concerned about the levels of corruption. I mean, for example, Kenyatta, while seen as a really pro-development person, and this was in one of the recent articles by a journal called Africa in Fact, where they looked into Kenyatta's legacy, and really saying, though he has delivered, for example, on a railway between Nairobi and Mombasa, there have been a lot of allegations of corruption, inflation of prices, and all of these things, which are always, of course, an accompaniment to big infrastructure projects across the world. These infrastructure projects tend to have a serious attachment of corruption to them. Now, it doesn't seem as if people who are implicated in corruption, who are favorable to the president, are actually brought to book. People do not feel that corruption fighting agencies within the country are given enough clout, capacity, and are institutionally protected to do their job without fear or favor. So these talks around corruption, good governance, justice can only work where everybody is equal before the law, and then there's no favor that is rendered to someone simply because they are aligned with the right people within the leadership structures of the Jubilee Party. So I do think that it's a mixed bag, really, where people say we are seeing some strides being made in the health sector, free coverage on maternity. We are seeing strides being made in electrification of houses, about 2 million people brought into the national grid. Now, but some people are saying, well, we are also aware that there's controversy insofar as the oil exploration is concerned, where exploration even took place before actually the legislation was put into place to make sure that there is a clear demarcation of duties on who would explore, how the country would benefit from the oil that is to be discovered off the coast of Kenya. Now, all these things tie up together to say ultimately, how do you view the Jubilee Party and its president insofar as they are committed to good governance? It is really a mixed bag of delivery on the one hand, but delivery that is very much tainted in some respects.
The other thing, Liesl, is the National Alliance, Super Alliance, National Super Alliance, NASA. It talks about one of the things they are going to do is to tinker with the Constitution in terms of devolving powers to the counties. How do you tinker with a fairly new Constitution?
Yes, it is very new, and I mean, all the political parties were consulted in this process, which was a very thorough process, I think, in the wake of the 2008 elections. The county system is also new, so of course there are things that could be tinkered with, or there are certain nuances, and again this election will be a test to see how. I think the county system is predominantly also because of, to diffuse some of the ethnic tensions, and the Jubilee Party, who is seen as, you know, I mean the NASA representing the marginalized smaller ethnic groups, while the Jubilee Party is more seen as being Kikuyu, although those lines aren't drawn that clearly.
There's a grouping of these tribes called the Jema.
Yes, the smaller ones. But perhaps just to come back to the International Criminal Court, there has been an overhaul of the justice system in Kenya. And we at the Institute for Security Studies did a lot of work. We have an office there and have been writing a lot about that, well, a couple of years ago. Because the ICC referral was predominantly because the justice system in Kenya didn't have the capacity. Kofi Annan said, you know, you investigate this violence and bring people to book, but it never happened. And so it was referred to the ICC. And in 2013, Uhuru Kenyatta almost came in on that ticket to say, I'm a victim of the ICC, and we know very well how controversial the ICC is. So there was an overall to make sure that if there are abuses again, and if there are human rights abuses, that hopefully the Kenyan justice system and the criminal justice system has the capacity to investigate. But it definitely has its limits, and when it comes to corruption, I mean, yeah.
On the security front, the NASA grouping, they proposed that they would begin a phased pull-out of the Kenyan defense forces from Somalia beginning 90 days and secure the Kenyan-Somali border. How do you, is this the problem when the terrorism happens, because there's the Kenyan armies in Somalia? You referred to it earlier.
Yes, it's extremely controversial. You know, Al-Shabaab says it wants the Kenyan army out. Now, Kenya is part, of course, of the African Union force, AMISOM, which doesn't have any more money and is going to be withdrawing from Somalia in any case from 2018. Well, that's officially. Many people say the Somali government and the Somali army will never really have the capacity to fight Al-Shabaab, and now we have the Americans there that are bombing Al-Shabaab, etc. So Kenya will have to, if it wants to withdraw, do this in consultation, of course, with all the other forces and the AMISOM that is in Kenya. But it was extremely controversial, and there are many people who say, well, Kenya went into Somalia to fight Al-Shabaab, but because of that, the terrorist attacks increased. I mean, we've seen devastating attacks in Nairobi, in the border areas near Somalia. And Kenyan military, one must admit, has also been accused of corruption in Somalia. Trafficking going on through some of the towns that the Kenyan army is controlling in Somalia. So it could be that for the NASA to put that on the table will make some voters vote for them and say, yes, we should withdraw because it's high time, and it really hasn't served our interests.
Let's go back to this issue of security, Lukona. The Kenya is home to the world's largest refugee camp, the Dadaab, which houses more than 280,000 people of Somali descent. And recently, President Kenyatta threatened to close down Dadaab and send the Somali refugees to an uncertain future. Is this the solution to terrorism?
Well, of course, it is not a solution to terrorism, but also Kenya, of course, by the prescripts of international law on refugees, has to protect and anybody who comes into the country, especially when they are fleeing visible situations of instability, political instability, violence in their countries, possible persecution, and all of these things. And of course, we do know that there was at some point in Somalia a serious hunger, and there's always a cycle of returning hunger due to partly drought issues, but also the political environment that makes it very difficult for any government to actually function in a way that would deliver services to its people. So the Kenyan government is actually bounded by international law insofar as that question is concerned. I think it would be a scandal of great proportion if ever the Kenyan government were to be allowed to shut down that refugee camp and send people, as you would say, to an uncertain future. And of course, it is not a solution to the terrorism within the country. The army part of it, the army being in Somalia, was seen as one of probably legitimate, I won't quote unquote legitimate reasons to fear terrorist attacks, because Al-Shabaab was quite clear that they wouldn't want anything on the Somalian soil that is an army from the Kenyan government. But as time goes by, of course, Kenya also has obligations to the African Union. It must also be seen as acting as one of the big players in the East African community. So they then ended up deploying that force. I think achieving greater political stability in the region and the question of Somalia probably needs much more renewed diplomatic interventions, much more renewed diplomatic efforts, which I think come on and off from time to time. People are willing to pursue those diplomatic channels, and then they retreat and give up as well. So I think that the question that has been asked around the question of migration, especially people leaving their countries because of political strife and destitution, is what do receiving countries do to actually make sure that conditions back at home are in such a manner that people can go back and return to them, because displaced people do not migrate solely because it is nice to do so. They are really forced, and they would love to go back home. And I do think that the question of diplomatic engagements, and probably this is more a question on the African Union and its usefulness or lack thereof, to say, is the African Union doing justice to issues of regional instability in the continent? And if they are not doing so, what capacities do heads of states propose should be placed to the African Union for it to be able to help and resolve some of these things? Because country to country, there are problems in terms of bilaterals on trying to solve some of these issues, and that is why regional bodies tend to be seen to carry more clout to stabilize region. And in ECOWAS, to a great extent in the continent, doing some phenomenal work in trying to reach instances of stability in that region where they are threatened. They have not succeeded in all parts of ECOWAS, but at least they have attempted, and I think they are one body that some lessons can be borrowed for some regions within the continent insofar as how do you intervene to bring about stability, long-lasting stability, that is.
I want to go back to this issue of the coalitions in Kenya. Analysts believe that there's a strong incentive to limit the size of the winning coalition in order not to dilute each winner, in order not to dilute each winner's share of the spoils. Coalitions are thus looking for the most excluding device, defined as a trait that permits an easy identification of the winners and the losers. In other words, you must not win too much so that I lose out, and that makes the government a little bit susceptible.
Yes, of course. I mean, if there is a coalition, then every one of those smaller parties that are part of it needs to get a ministry. That goes without saying. But one must also say that the experience on the African continent is that this multiplication of very small parties that have got very little capacity has often led to the fact that the incumbent just stays in power, changes the constitution, continues to stay in power, and that's why you see even in countries like Zimbabwe, the opposition now trying over and over again to get together and try and fight ZANU-PF in 2018, and in other parts in Francophone Africa, it's always been a big problem that you had the splintering of parties because of, let's put it bluntly, the ego of politicians often who just want to run their own show. In Kenya, the ethnic dimension, as you mentioned, does play a role. So you have these smaller parties that are identified with smaller groupings. But it's something that worked. I mean, that the first elections in 2002, that is how KANU, the party that's been in power forever in Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta and Daniel Arap Moi, they were defeated by the Rainbow Coalition. I remember very well the excitement that there was for the first time, I mean that was 2002, to defeat a ruling party that had such strong roots. And there it was Uhuru Kenyatta who was beaten by this coalition led by Mwai Kibaki.
Lukona, I couldn't but go back to a book written by Michaela Wrong, It's Our Turn to Eat, the story of a Kenyan whistleblower. I don't understand. Yes, the two parties are mentioning corruption in their manifestos, but they don't spell it out. How are they going to deal with it?
Well, politicians are the last people to want to spell out how they are going to deal with corruption if they still have an interest to actually feast on the trough of corruption. The reality that you have there is that Kenyan politics are quite elitist, and they revolve, as you opened and the scene, and we're setting the scene in the opening of the show, they do revolve around what we term dynasty politics, where certain families are seen as the custodians of power and ruling. And if you drive around some parts of Nairobi, the outskirts of Nairobi, and you are shown the vast tracts of land that the elites benefited during the process of land restitution and all of that, you get a sense that, of course, while they might want to talk good governance, corruption, fairness and justice, they do not see themselves as part of those processes. And this is what makes it difficult to entrust such people with fights against corruption, because it would be a selective fight on corruption. As you would say, the book by Michaela Wrong, Our Turn to Eat, it's always a substitution effect, where we feel the fellows have eaten too much. There needs to be a change so that we ourselves can have our hands on the levers of power, and then make sure that we have close proximity to state resources, safeguard procurement processes for our own benefit while we are trying to do this development. And really, until we talk about one, dynasty politics, two, the vast wealth that has been inherited by people that see themselves as political royalty simply because of the power of the part that their families played in the struggle for liberation and so on, we will not go far on questions of corruption, because we entrust people who have a serious self-interest to be part of leading good governance, to be part of leading fair and just systems of governance. And it is not designed for it to thrive simply because of the vested interest that they have themselves as the leaders.
The other thing, Lukona made reference to it there, the vast tracts of land that are owned by families in Kenya. And there's this story that I read in the Forbes magazine, Forbes Africa magazine, that Uhuru Kenyatta is also the richest man in Kenya, the 26th richest man in Africa. What role did money play in this election?
Absolutely, a lot. The campaign, as I said earlier, very modern campaign. You saw the images of the helicopters going. There's something like 88 or 85 helicopters running around, campaigning for the various candidates, because supposedly the roads aren't good enough to go from one place to the other, but it's still quite astonishing. And it plays a very important role because the fact that the one with the most money can win, just like in the US, is very problematic. And there were some voices that asked for political party funding to be regularized and that there be a cap on how much money can be spent on elections, especially in a country that still struggles with poverty and underdevelopment.
With infrastructure, as you mentioned.
Absolutely, huge challenges. And then we have this election campaign that is being fought with massive amount of money. I mean, Raila Odinga is also not poor.
Well, he would be called as a part of the dynasty if he was poor.
Yes, well, yeah, and they have very important backers, business people that are backing up both sides. And that's something as well, as we're talking about other countries, that could be a salutary kind of new dimension that we could bring into democratic elections, is if there were more scrutiny of party funding and then spending on elections. Like in some European countries, you just have so much, you are not allowed to go beyond a certain limit of what you can spend on elections, just to limit in a way the capacity for money to play such a big role in elections.
Well, Liesl and Lukona, we can sit here and discuss for months on end and days and years about elections in Africa. We'll get another opportunity when the elections in Angola come up, interesting elections in Angola also coming up. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to close today's discussion. Let me quote from Samuel. He said to all Israel, "I have listened to everything you said to me and have set a king over you. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I am old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I've been your leader from my youth until this day. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I have done any of these, I will make it right. You have not cheated or oppressed us." Yes, they replied. "You have not taken anything from anyone's hand." This has been Right and Recourse. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the SABC or Right and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning. From all of us in the studio, thank you to our guests and goodbye.